Iranian here. They keep asking the same question. Why are lefties, why are the loudest pro-Gaza voices completely silent when it comes to Iran? Well, the answer is simple, because the truth exposes the lie. They will chant free Palestine, but they will never say free Iran, because that will require admitting something unforgivable, that political Islam is not liberation, it is domination. And that is exactly what's been happening in the West, by the way.
Welcome to the Nut House. In the year 711 AD, the Iberian Peninsula, now known as Spain, was invaded by Muslims. Tariq bin Ziyad commanded a military expedition against the Visigoth-controlled kingdom of Toledo, which comprised the former Roman territory of Hispania. This was the first invasion into Europe and one of many military conquests all the way from Spain in the west to India in the eastern part of the world, conducted by Islamic forces. To put the Islamic invasion of Spain into perspective, the First Crusade, the very first one, was in 1096, which is almost 400 years later after Spain was invaded by Muslims. A lot of people today are brainwashed into thinking the Crusades were terrible and they show how horrible us Christians are, but they leave out the part where Muslims had been attacking Europe for hundreds of years before the Crusades ever began. They leave this inconvenient fact out of the history books because they want to push for an anti-West agenda. They got to make room for the New World Order, so they got to get rid of the West. There's also an anti-white agenda as well, basically for the same reasons. The two things are intertwined, which is why the real powers that be are invading Europe and the United States at the same time with Muslims from places like Somalia and elsewhere. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that any single heritage or race is a bad thing or anything else. All I'm saying and doing is simply explaining the reason why they do what they do. That's the people who really run this world, that is. As I've said before, I'm a Christian, and I see all people as souls worthy of Savior. But I think that my thoughts align with the message of the Good Samaritan and Paul's decision to preach to the Gentiles. As a matter of fact, Jesus himself had at least one Gentile ancestor. So everyone is worthy of being saved if they just come to Christ. But the point of all this video works in several different ways. This explains how history can be distorted to serve a purpose, but not created brand new out of whole cloth. Like, for example, I don't buy into the idea of resets or mud floods, but I know a lot of people do, and I can respect our differences of opinion on this. So more power to anyone who does believe in that. We can just agree to disagree. But from my point of view, the history of Islamic invasions in Charles Martel are great examples of how they do not teach this in school for a reason. And that reason is that if more people knew the truth about this part of history, then they would not be as easy to brainwash. So that's how I think history works, is that they just don't teach it anymore and hope it goes away. That's different again as just to make a whole civilization up that never existed. There's a difference. A great example of how brainwashed people tend to lack a solid foundation of historic fundamentals would be how they brainwash some of the liberals to think they should support women's rights and Islam at the same time. But they are not taught the history of Islam enough to realize that well over 70% of the worldwide Muslims support Sharia law, which is completely opposed to women's rights from a Western perspective. So there is no way to sanely support both of these things at the same time. But then again, that involves critical thinking and avoiding cognitive dissonance. So they depend on the ignorance of the populace to help control these people. So Charles Martel is just as relevant now as he was back in the year 732. Anyway, as we have previously mentioned, Muslims invaded Spain in the year 711. The Visigoths, who were invaded there, were the same people who ended the Roman Empire several hundred years before this. The Visigoth king, Roderick, was killed in the battle with the invading Muslims. They were mostly Berbers who crossed into Spain from North Africa. The Visigoth kingdom collapsed quickly. The majority of Iberia became a Muslim-ruled territory. In fact, Muslim rule in Iberia did not end until 1492, which coincidentally was the same year that Columbus sailed to the Americas of the New World. Now, just 21 years after the invasion of Spain, Muslim forces began to invade Gaul, which today we would call France, to face Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, around the area of the center of France. What people don't realize is why this was important. This battle would determine the fate of Europe. It is impossible to overstate how high the stakes were for the Battle of Tours in France. But before we dive deeper into that battle itself, we need to take a look at Muslim expansion around the world to put this all into perspective. I'm including a map here to give people a better look at how Muslim forces over time had invaded the known world all the way from Spain in the west to India in the east. So after Muhammad's death in 632, the early Islamic caliphates expanded exponentially. They conquered the Levant, Egypt, North Africa, and Persia, which today is called Iran. This brought Muslim forces all the way to Europe's doorstep. And as we have already stated, the most successful Muslim entry into Europe began when Muslim forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and into southern Spain. From there, they defeated the Visigoth kingdom and killed their king. Within a few years, most of Iberia was under Muslim rule. The invasion succeeded due to the following: a Visigoth civil war, weak centralized resistance, and the use of local alliances, and the Muslim forces from there pushed all the way into southern France. Italy was also invaded by Muslim armies. Often forgotten, they started conquering Sicily in 827 AD, and Sicily became a Muslim emirate for close to 200 years. In southern Italy, the Muslims invaded Rome, including the Vatican outskirts. There were also short-lived emirates in Bari and elsewhere, so Italy was in constant war at that time with Islam. Now let's talk about the Balkans and Eastern Europe for a minute. To begin with, there was a very limited early penetration there by the Muslims. In fact, Byzantine defenses held firm as long as they could, and Constantinople resisted major sieges from 674 to 718 AD. And had Constantinople fallen early, Europe's history would look very different indeed. And later, Muslim rule reached the Balkans via the Ottomans. Finally, the Ottomans took Constantinople in 1453. They conquered the Balkans and even reached Vienna twice. This was a sustained imperial push into Europe. This was at the time when Vlad the Impaler rose to power. History has tended to paint him as a monster, but the truth is, he was a hero who was fighting to protect his homeland from the invading Muslims in the east. But the people of today who are fighting against the Islamic tide today in modern times, whether that be in Great Britain or in Minnesota, are also painted as villains by the press. So strange how there is nothing new under the sun. And so while our ancestors had to fight to protect our way of life back then, today the West is slitting its own throats as it allows itself to be invaded by Muslims today. There are many reasons for this. One, we have forgotten the past due to the brainwashing propaganda that is all around us. Two, this should be a wake-up call that our so-called elected leaders are not really on our side. Don't believe me? Go talk to all the women in Eastern Europe being assaulted now by the religion of so-called peace. And for the slow people out there still riding the little yellow bus and waiting for Q and the White House to save you, if this doesn't wake you up, then nothing will. And just in case you didn't notice, our elected officials are allowing the same people to run us over as they are in Europe. Wow, what a coincidence. Wake the hell up. So the West stupidly keeps trusting the political system that is designed to control them. And three, they are too scared to lose what little wealth they have. And there is all the fraud connected to Somalis in Minnesota. You really have to not be surprised by this. And don't be suckered by Tim Walz. The whole thing is theater. Never trust the mainstream Project Mockingbird news. It reminds me of 9/11 and blaming everything on Muslims. Don't get me wrong. Islam is far from a religion of peace, but they are still not the ones who are really pulling the strings, are they? They are more like useful pawns. That doesn't mean to take them lightly. It just means that there is someone else pulling the strings. And I think everyone should read the Quran for themselves to see all the plagiarism and reprehensible things it says firsthand. In my personal opinion, Islam is like the Manchurian candidate of the religious world. I have heard the theory that Islam was created by the Catholic Church. More specifically, it was created by the Jesuits. I believe the mother of Muhammad, for example, was a Catholic. Anyway, the theory goes that Islam is a Jesuit psyop here to serve as a tool. And there is certainly a possibility that this is true. The other odd thing about Islam is its similarity to Mormonism. They both involve some kind of miraculous event that only the practitioners could see and nobody else. And in the case of the Church of Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith was also a Freemason. And the interesting thing about this is that Freemasons, believe it or not, in my personal opinion, are somewhat related to the Jesuits and their true belief system, which I'm not going to go into here on this platform for obvious reasons. But speaking of Freemasons, the Freemasons were said to have also been linked back to the Knights Templar, which supposedly protected pilgrims on their quests for the Holy Land. But the Knights instead were searching for something else in the desert, like occult knowledge and relics. In fact, some would say that the Knights Templar worshiped the Baphomet. But an interesting aspect of this is that there are people who think the word Baphomet is actually a corruption of the word Mohammed. Interesting. And keep in mind that I'm leaving out things that I cannot say in this platform. But the banking system that we have today, which is the evil octopus with its tentacles into everything, aka central banks like the Federal Reserve, started with the Knights Templar in the Crusades with the Muslims. So you see, not everything is what it appears on the outside. It is almost as if there's always been a secret brotherhood among us, slowly guiding and controlling the direction the world takes for eons in the dark, all tied together like a twisted knot of hidden conspiracy and the occult. Even the Rothschilds were behind creating the modern state of Israel. So between the Muslims, the Jesuits, the Rothschilds, and the Masons, there seems to have been an interlocking secret agenda as old as the sands of the desert itself. So, don't believe me? Look at the Shriners. Those red fez hats that they wear, they symbolize the Ottoman blood of Christians that the Turkish Muslims dipped their hats into to stain them red. But alas, I digress. Specifically getting back to Muslims, let's take a look at some of the other places in the world that were affected by Islamic military expansion. It all started with Mecca, then Medina, and surrounding Arabian tribes. Then they invaded Europe, North Africa, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, and more. So at one point, it seemed as if the entire world was being overrun by Islam. So Europe itself was in danger of being taken over by Islam during the time of Charles Martel. And Muslim expansion is still on the rise today. They believe it's okay to lie to the infidel until they outnumber them and then take over. So the Islamic worldview really hasn't stopped this entire time. And the Islamic world remembers Charles Martel far better than we do. They are not told to placate everyone the way we are. So the stakes were high for Charles Martel. A loss would mean the end of Europe as we know it, and quite possibly the end of Christianity. So there was a lot riding on this battle, and the reason why we are not speaking in Arabic and busting out prayer rugs while practicing today is due to Charles Martel. Sharia law is a direct result of what happens there, including women's rights. So let's go over who Charles Martel was and what actually happened at the Battle of Tours in France, or what's now known as France, and why this is something everyone should know about. Charles Martel was born in 688 AD. His nickname, the Hammer, was earned in battle. Technically, he was not a king, but in reality, he basically served the same purpose as a king in all but name. His title was Mayor of the Palace of the Frankish Kingdoms. He was the founder of the Carolingian line and the grandfather of Charlemagne. And even though he never truly wore a royal crown, he was the real power behind the throne in what is now France, Belgium, Western Germany, and parts of the Netherlands. By Charles's time, the Moravian kings were basically figureheads. Real authority had shifted to the mayors of the palace, officials who managed the court, army, and administration as well. Charles took control after a brutal civil war, and he ruled de facto as king in all but name, and he united Frankish realms under strong central leadership. So think of him like the CEO, while the king was more or less a ceremonial chairman. Charles Martel reshaped Frankish warfare. He created a professional, well-trained army. He paid soldiers with land grants, though, instead of loot, and laid down the foundations for what would later become medieval feudalism. Charles strengthened heavy infantry tactics that dominated Europe for centuries, and that's how his family stayed in power long after he was dead. Charles supported Christian expansion as well, and missionaries like St. Boniface. He helped organize church structures in German lands, but he also seized church lands to fund his army, which was not popular with the bishops, but the clergy benefited from his protection, even if they grumbled about his methods. His son was Pepin the Short, who became the king of the Franks in 751. His grandson was Charlemagne, who was later crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD. Without Charles, it would have been a very different medieval Europe. He was the guy who set everything up, but never got the crown of the glory. What led up to the Battle of Tours was the expansion of the Caliphate. They conquered the Middle East and then took North Africa. Then the Muslim Caliphate crossed into Spain, and in the year 711 defeated the Visigoth kingdom and killed their king. And as mentioned previously, this was at a time of Islamic military expansion and conquest around the world as Muslim forces began to spread everywhere. And in France, Muslim forces were pushing north with raids into southern France. At the time, southern Gaul was semi-independent, so Duke Odo of Aquitaine initially fought the Muslim forces on his own. But after suffering from several defeats, Odo turned to Charles Martel for help. And this Muslim military expansion on the Muslims was what led to the Battle of Tours, just 21 years after Islamic forces under the Caliphate had initially invaded Spain. The Caliphate army was likely to be around 30,000 troops with a strong cavalry, including light and medium horse. And the Muslim forces were battle-hardened from decades of expansion. But the army of Charles Martel was mostly just heavy infantry. But they were well trained and disciplined. Charles had much fewer cavalry, so one of the deciding factors in this battle was that he chose the terrain carefully to try to neutralize the enemy's strengths. So this matchup was all about infantry versus cavalry. The location of the battle was somewhere between Tours and Poitiers. The terrain was slightly elevated ground, and it was in a forested area in the cold October weather. Charles forced the Muslim army to attack uphill into unfavorable conditions far from their supply base. This was strategic patience and not luck, and I can only assume the ground was wet and muddy from the weather, which must have made it difficult for the heavy cavalry of the Islamic Caliphate forces that day. Both armies faced each other for several days, actually. There would have been skirmishes and probing attacks, but Charles refused to be drawn into the open ground. This alone frustrated the Caliphate forces, who relied upon mobility and momentum. But regardless, the Muslim cavalry charged repeatedly, but the Frankish infantry formed dense defensive blocks, their shields locked, and their spears braced. Despite all of the heavy pressure put against them, the Frankish line did not break, which was unheard of against the cavalry at this time. The turning point in the battle was when the Muslim commander was killed by the forces of Charles Martel. Their leadership collapse mattered more than the casualties. A rumor spread that the Frankish troops were attacking the Muslim camp and taking their loot, so some of the cavalry broke off to protect their spoils. This fractured their cohesion as an armed force. The fighting stopped at dusk. Charles expected renewed attacks the next day, and instead, the Caliphate forces withdrew during the night as they retreated to the south. Charles did not pursue the retreating army aggressively. His infantry wasn't ideal for chasing cavalry, and with this decisive victory over the Islamic forces, the raids into France basically stopped. The implications for this battle are huge. If Charles Martel would have been defeated, then that would have been the end of Europe as we know it, and the end of Western culture. We would all be speaking Arabic right now, and Christianity would no longer exist. But also things like the voyage of Christopher Columbus would have never happened either. I mean, the whole direction of the world history itself would have been drastically altered forever. So this is the part of history that they do not teach you in school. The brainwashing machine that we call education never told you about Islamic aggression against the rest of the world hundreds of years before the First Crusade even began. Instead, they act as if the Crusades were just proof of how bad Christianity is and all the wars done in Christ's name, etc. It's just a way to bash Christians. So they purposefully take this all out of context. And the people who really run this world tell us how bad we are and how we need to apologize and support every other culture in the world except for our own. And they never tell you how close we came to losing our own culture in the West to the so-called religion of peace. Also, this is how history works. The powers that be did not push the easy button and wipe the memory of Charles Martel magically from our minds. It doesn't work that way. They simply hid the fact from you. They never taught you about Charles Martel because it does not fit the narrative that they are shoving down our throats to make us passively accept being herded into extinction. They don't want us to defend our culture and our heritage and our beliefs. So we have to actively use our critical thinking skills and research to discover the truth for ourselves. I'm a Christian, so I pray for my enemies, and this is really not my home anyway. I'm just passing through. So beyond the physical struggles of this carnal existence is the eternal ramifications of the Spirit. Remember that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and wickedness in high places. Now that said, for all the people who want to fight back against the forces of this world on a more physical level, then you need to know who Charles Martel was, the Hammer, because he was fighting the good fight long before you against overwhelming odds and superior numbers and with less firepower and still won. At the very least, you wouldn't even have anything worth fighting for if it wasn't for Charles Martel. So this is something everybody should know. I hope you all found this to be interesting, and according to the odds, before watching this video, the vast majority of the people in here probably had no idea who Charles Martel was. And don't forget to remember, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. So remember. God bless you all in Jesus' name.